In the gilded towers of Dubai's most exclusive district, where oil money buys silence and tradition trumps law, the most scandalous wedding of March 2019 lasted exactly one night. By sunrise, the young Filipina bride was dead. Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed had vanished into his compound, and his first wife Chenila was burning documents in her private study. But here's what the family servants whispered in the shadows, what the police were never told, what the international media never discovered. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was the culmination of a three-woman chess game that had been building for years, where secrets, shame, and revenge collided in the marble corridors of power. The world saw a tragic story of cultural clash and family honor. The truth was far more sinister. Three women had been locked in a deadly battle of manipulation and survival, each believing they were protecting what mattered most. Only one would survive to tell her version of the story. This case was buried by wealth and influence, but some truths refused to stay hidden. The blood on those marble floors tells a story of desperation, deception, and the deadly price women pay when tradition becomes a weapon. Perlah Dela Cruz, 26 years old, who had spent years becoming the most invisible person in the Al-Mansouri household. She moved through the marble corridors like a ghost, caring for Haja Khadija, Sheikh Rashid's beloved elderly aunt, with the kind of endless patience that made her indispensable and, more dangerously, noticed. To everyone who observed her, Perlah represented the ideal they desperately wanted to believe still existed. Humble, devout, grateful for every opportunity. When Haja Khadija would cry for her deceased husband, Perlah would hold her arthritic hands and recite prayers with tears streaming down her own face. But Perlah Dela Cruz was living a masterpiece of deception that had taken every survival instinct she possessed to maintain. Back in Nueva Ecija, Philippines, in the rice fields where poverty carved lines into faces before their time, lay the truth that could destroy everything she had built. Hidden in a small municipal office where records gathered dust, a marriage certificate dated March 2015 bore her real signature next to that of Carlos Miguel Santos, a jeepney driver whose promises had lasted exactly 8 months. More devastating still was the birth certificate dated January 2016 for Princess May Santos, now a 3-year-old girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, being raised by Perlah's mother in a house that Perlah's Dubai salary kept from falling apart. Every month, she sent home nearly everything she earned, telling the Al-Mansouri household it was for her aging parents' medical expenses. The transformation from abandoned young mother to perfect Muslim convert had cost Perlah $3,000, a fortune that had required her to borrow against future earnings. A forger in Manila who specialized in helping overseas Filipino workers escape complicated pasts had crafted her new identity with meticulous care. Baptismal certificates showing childhood conversion to Islam, employment records with no gaps, character references from people who had never met her. For 3 years, Perlah had been performing the role of her life. Every smile she offered Sheikh Rashid was calculated. Every grateful glance was performed. Every moment of what appeared to be genuine affection was part of an elaborate survival strategy that required her to read his moods, anticipate his needs, and present herself as the antithesis of everything that frustrated him about modern women. Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed Al-Mansouri carried the weight of dynastic expectations like a man born to wear invisible chains. At 48, he was everything his family had molded him to be. Harvard-educated but traditionally minded, capable of closing billion-dollar real estate deals in the morning and leading evening prayers for the household staff. His marriage to Chenila 24 years earlier had been a strategic masterpiece, uniting two of Dubai's most influential families. But by 2019, the Golden Son was facing a crisis that all his education and wealth couldn't solve. His father, Abu Saeed, at 78 was growing increasingly vocal about the need for fresh blood in the family line. The 3 children from his marriage to Chenila were causing whispers. His eldest son preferred London nightclubs to business, his daughter studied gender studies at Berkeley, and his youngest son's learning disabilities were a source of private shame. Rashid's growing fascination with Perlah wasn't born purely from family pressure. For months, he had been watching her care for his aunt, with a devotion that reminded him of stories about women from simpler times. What he couldn't see was that his attraction to Perlah's authenticity was actually attraction to the most sophisticated performance he had ever encountered. His traditional values created dangerous blind spots. He valued female purity above all else, believed deception was unforgivable, and viewed his ability to judge character as fundamental to his authority. These convictions, combined with his explosive temper when honor was threatened, would prove lethal when confronted with truth. For 24 years, Chenila bint Hassan al-Qasimi had been the undisputed queen of the Al-Mansouri household, and she had no intention of abdicating her throne to a Filipino servant. At 45, Chenila possessed intelligence that had made her invaluable to her husband's empire and dangerous to anyone who underestimated her. Through charity work and diplomatic events, she had built an intelligence network that stretched across the Gulf region. The marriage to Perlah represented more than personal humiliation. It was an existential threat to the social order she had spent decades perfecting. From the moment Rashid showed interest in Perlah, Chenila's instincts screamed warnings. She had spent her life reading people, and Perlah's apparent perfection triggered every alarm. No one was that grateful, that devoted, that eager to please without having something significant to hide. Chenila's plan was elegant in its cruelty. Allow the wedding to proceed, let Rashid commit completely to this union in front of Dubai's elite, then reveal the truth on their wedding night when the humiliation would be maximum. What she hadn't anticipated was that her perfectly orchestrated revelation would trigger a violence that would destroy everything she had worked to protect. In September 2018, Sheikh Rashid approached Perlah in his aunt's sitting room after evening prayers. His words were formal but kind. He wished to honor her by making her his second wife, offering her security and status she could never achieve as a servant. For Perlah, this moment represented everything she had dreamed of during 3 years of careful servitude: stability, legitimacy, and the chance to bring Princess May to Dubai legally. She saw in Rashid a traditionally minded but kind man who valued her devotion and would protect her. What she couldn't see was that his attraction to her apparent purity was matched by an obsession with female virtue that bordered on fanatical. In his mind, women were either pure or corrupted, and deception about such matters was the most unforgivable sin imaginable. Perlah accepted with appropriate humility, believing she had found her salvation, unaware that she was walking toward a man whose traditional values could turn lethal when threatened. When Rashid announced their engagement to his family that evening, 3 separate war rooms activated across 2 continents. What followed was 6 months of psychological warfare so sophisticated that intelligence agencies would have been impressed by its scope and precision. Chenila al-Qasimi's response to her husband's announcement was immediate and surgical. Within hours of learning about Rashid's intentions, she was making carefully worded phone calls to contacts cultivated over decades of diplomatic charity work and elite social maneuvering. Her network wasn't just extensive, it was strategically positioned at every level of power that mattered. Her first call went to Amira al-Zahra, wife of the UAE's cultural attaché to the Philippines, under the guise of discussing routine security verification for expanded household responsibilities. This led to an introduction to Detective Elena Rodriguez of the Manila Metropolitan Police, a woman who specialized in background investigations for overseas employment and had developed a reputation for discretion when dealing with Gulf families' requests. But Chenila didn't stop with official channels. Through her Women's Charity Foundation, she had connections with embassy staff, immigration officials, and even social workers who dealt with overseas Filipino workers. Each contact received a slightly different story about security concerns, family protection, and the need for thorough background verification. The investigation that Rodriguez conducted was more comprehensive than anything typically done for domestic workers. Within 2 weeks, she had assembled a devastating portfolio: original marriage and birth certificates from Nueva Ecija Municipal Hall, hospital records from Perlah's delivery, witness statements from neighbors who remembered the abandoned young wife, and even social media photographs showing Perlah with her husband and baby before her disappearance to Dubai. The manila envelope that arrived at Chenila's private office in December 2018 contained enough evidence to destroy 10 women, but she held it like a chess master who had just achieved checkmate in advance. The documents proved not only that Perlah was already married with a child, but that she had systematically falsified her identity to obtain overseas employment, a criminal offense that could result in immediate deportation and permanent blacklisting from the UAE. Chenila's patience was strategic. Rather than immediately confronting Rashid with the evidence, she began the delicate work of timing her revelation for maximum psychological and social impact. She wanted the wedding to proceed far enough that the humiliation would be complete and irreversible. 3 years of living in constant fear had given Perlah supernatural awareness of danger, and by late 2018, every nerve in her body was screaming warnings that something was wrong. The changes started subtly. Longer, more calculating stares from Chenila during family gatherings, conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms, and a shift in how other household staff treated her that only someone living in perpetual survival mode would notice. The first concrete evidence came during her weekly video call with her mother in January 2019. Rosa Dela Cruz, caring for 2-year-old Princess May in their small barangay house, whispered in rapid Tagalog that strangers had been asking questions about Perlah's past, her marriage, her departure from the Philippines. The inquiries were disguised as routine surveys and employment verifications, but to a woman who had spent years watching for threats, the pattern was unmistakable. Perlah began her own careful counter-investigation within the household. Using her position as a nearly invisible servant, she started paying attention to phone calls, noting which family members left for unusual appointments, and observing the subtle power dynamics between Rashid and Chenila with the analytical eye of someone whose life depended on reading situations correctly. Her breakthrough came when she noticed Chenila making hushed calls from her private study at unusual hours, always in English rather than Arabic, a sign that the conversations involved non-family members. Through careful observation and her access to household schedules, Perlah began to understand that Chenila was conducting some kind of investigation, though she couldn't yet comprehend its scope. The desperation that followed this realization led Perlah to make the decision that would seal her fate. She began pushing for an accelerated wedding timeline. In her mind, becoming Rashid's wife quickly would provide legal protection from whatever investigation was underway. She started subtly encouraging his romantic gestures, expressing concerns that waiting too long might give his family more time to create obstacles to their happiness. What Perlah didn't understand was that her urgency was playing directly into Chenila's strategy. The first wife had been planning to reveal the evidence before any marriage could take place, but Perlah's push for a faster wedding forced a more sophisticated approach. Let the ceremony proceed, then destroy both bride and groom's credibility simultaneously on their wedding night. By March 2019, the Al-Mansouri household had become a stage where 3 master manipulators were performing their final acts before a deadly collision. Rashid threw himself into wedding preparations with the enthusiasm of a man who believed he was writing a progressive love story that would be remembered for generations. He personally selected the Burj Al Arab's private function hall, insisting on a celebration that would honor both Emirati tradition and Filipino heritage. To him, this wedding represented everything he valued: respect for tradition combined with openness to change, the elevation of a worthy woman regardless of her background, and a demonstration of his independence from family pressure. Chenila played the role of gracious first wife to absolute perfection. She publicly supported the marriage, even offering to help with arrangements, a display of magnanimity that enhanced her reputation while positioning her perfectly for the betrayal to come. Privately, she was orchestrating the timing of her revelation with surgical precision, ensuring that recording devices would capture every moment of the wedding night confrontation. Meanwhile, Perlah was making her own desperate preparations. Sensing that time was running out, she transferred larger amounts of money home, ostensibly for her parents' medical expenses but actually to ensure Princess May's security if her situation collapsed. She also began secretly recording household conversations, storing audio files in a cloud account that her mother could access, insurance against whatever catastrophe her instincts told her was approaching. The tragic irony was that all 3 women were convinced they were protecting their families and securing their futures. None realized that their elaborate plans would collide in a violence that would destroy everyone involved. The wedding invitations had been sent, the venue was booked, and the trap was set. The only question remaining was which predator would ultimately become the prey. March 15, 2019 arrived like a perfectly choreographed performance where every actor knew their role except the one who would die before sunrise. The Burj Al Arab's private function hall had been transformed into a breathtaking fusion of Emirati and Filipino traditions, with golden Arabic calligraphy intertwined with sampaguita garlands and traditional oud music alternating with Filipino folk songs. Perlah looked radiant in her custom-designed gown, a masterpiece that combined modesty with Filipino elegance, though her hands trembled slightly as she signed the marriage contract. Guests attributed the trembling to wedding day nerves, not knowing it came from the adrenaline of a woman who sensed she was walking into a trap but had no choice but to spring it. Sheikh Rashid played his role as the defiant romantic hero flawlessly, kissing his father's hand in respect while making it clear this marriage represented his independence and progressive values. To the 500 guests, he appeared confident and happy, a successful man following his heart despite family pressures. But it was Chenila's performance that day that would be remembered by those who understood what they had witnessed. Dressed in an elegant traditional thobe that subtly emphasized her status as first wife, she graciously welcomed guests and even gave a touching speech about the expansion of their family. Today we celebrate not just a union, but the beautiful way love transcends all boundaries, she said, her voice carrying just the right note of emotional warmth. The guests applauded, impressed by her grace and maturity, never noticing how her eyes never quite reached her smile or how she kept checking her phone for a specific message. As midnight approached and the couple was escorted to their honeymoon suite, Chenila made her excuses and slipped away from the celebration. In her private study, she opened her safe and removed the manila envelope that contained Perlah's real history, along with a small recording device that would ensure whatever happened next would be documented for posterity. At 11:47 p.m., while Perlah was changing out of her wedding dress in the suite's marble bathroom, Sheikh Rashid discovered the envelope that would destroy both their worlds. His name was written on the front in Chenila's precise handwriting, with a simple note, "For your protection and the family's honor." Inside, the evidence was laid out like a prosecution case. Marriage certificates, birth records, hospital documents, and photographs that told the story of a life Perlah had hidden for 3 years. But the most devastating item was a recent photograph, clearly taken within the past month, showing a 2-year-old girl playing in a small yard, with a handwritten note on the back. Princess May Santos, daughter of Perlah Dela Cruz, currently being raised by grandmother Rosa Dela Cruz in Nueva Ecija, Philippines. Rashid's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The woman he had just married, the woman he had defied his family to protect and elevate, was already married. More than that, she was a mother who had abandoned her child to pursue what he now realized was a calculated deception. When Perlah emerged from the bathroom in her silk nightgown, expecting to find her new husband preparing for their wedding night, she instead found him sitting at the suite's desk with documents spread before him like evidence at a trial. "Who is Princess May?" His voice was deadly quiet. Perlah's blood turned to ice. The question she had dreaded for 3 years had finally been asked, and there was nowhere to run. The story poured out of her in a desperate torrent. The husband who had abandoned her, the child she loved but couldn't support, the impossible choices that had led her to Dubai, the forged documents that had given her a chance at a new life. "I never meant to hurt you," she sobbed. "I was just trying to survive, to give my daughter a better life. Everything I felt for you was real." But to Rashid, raised in a world where honor was everything and deception was unforgivable, her explanations sounded like more lies. Every tender moment, every expression of gratitude, every prayer they had shared, all of it was now contaminated by the knowledge that it had been built on a foundation of lies. The psychological confrontation that followed escalated beyond anything either had intended. Rashid's rage wasn't just about the deception, it was about the humiliation. In his world, a man's ability to judge character, especially in choosing a wife, was fundamental to his authority and respect. When Perlah, in her desperation, threatened to expose Chenila's role in orchestrating this discovery, his fury exploded into physical violence. The struggle was brief and brutal. When it ended, The suite was eerily quiet except for the distant sound of Dubai's traffic far below. 2 phones lay on the marble floor, still recording, and the fairy tale marriage that was supposed to prove love could conquer all had instead proved that some secrets are worth killing for. At 6:23 a.m. on March 16, 2019, as Dubai's golden sunrise painted the Burj Al Arab's windows, room service arrived at the presidential suite to find a scene that would haunt the hotel staff forever. Sheikh Rashid sat in the suite's living room, still in his wedding clothes but covered in blood, staring at his hands as if he couldn't understand what they had done. Perlah's body lay in the bedroom, her silk nightgown torn, her eyes staring at the ceiling she would never see again. Within minutes of the hotel's panicked call, the Al-Mansouri family's crisis management system activated with the efficiency of a military operation. Abu Saeed, despite his 78 years, took control with the authority of a man who had spent decades protecting his dynasty from scandal. The first call went to Khalil al-Blushi, the family's lawyer and fixer, who arrived at the hotel before the police did. The second call was to Dr. Ahmad Hassan, a discreet physician who specialized in handling sensitive medical situations for Dubai's elite families. By the time Dubai police arrived, they found a carefully choreographed scene. Sheikh Rashid had been sedated by Dr. Hassan and was being treated for severe psychological trauma, while the official story was that his wife had suffered a sudden medical emergency during their wedding night. The documents revealing Perlah's past had been quietly removed from the crime scene, and any recording devices were retrieved by family security before investigators could catalog the evidence. Chenila performed the role of shocked and grieving family member with the skill of a professional actress. She arrived at the hotel in traditional mourning clothes, supported by female relatives, making all the right statements about the tragic loss of a beloved new family member. To anyone watching, she appeared devastated by the unexpected death of the young woman she had publicly welcomed into their family just hours earlier. Detective Captain Yusuf Al-Rashid of Dubai Police found himself investigating a case where every piece of evidence seemed to lead to a dead end, and every witness had either been coached or silenced. The Al-Mansouri family's influence extended deep into Dubai's power structure, and the pressure to close the case quickly as a medical emergency was immense. The crime scene had been contaminated by family members and their private physician before police arrival. The hotel's security footage from the hallway mysteriously malfunctioned during crucial hours. Dr. Amira Hassan, the Pakistani forensic pathologist assigned to the case, found evidence that didn't match the official story. Perlah's injuries were consistent with violent assault, not sudden medical collapse. There were defensive wounds on her hands, indicating she had fought for her life. But when Dr. Hassan attempted to include these findings in her official report, she was visited by high-ranking police officials who suggested that her preliminary observations might have been mistaken, and that a more thorough examination would likely reveal natural causes of death. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. Dr. Hassan could pursue the truth and end her career in Dubai, or she could accept the official narrative and continue serving the Emirates' elite families. The investigation stalled when it became clear that pursuing the truth would require examining the Al-Mansouri family's role in the events leading to Perlah's death, an investigation that Dubai's political leadership had no appetite for conducting. 3 months after Perlah's death, the carefully constructed cover-up began showing cracks that oil money couldn't seal. The Filipino consulate in Dubai, under pressure from media attention in the Philippines, demanded a thorough investigation into the death of one of their nationals. International media began picking up the story, focusing on the mysterious circumstances surrounding the death of a Cinderella bride whose fairy tale had ended in tragedy. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Perlah's own preparation for this moment. Unknown to anyone, she had been secretly recording conversations in the household for months, storing the audio files in a cloud account that her mother in the Philippines could access. Among these recordings was a conversation between Chenila and her security chief, discussing the timing of when to reveal damaging information about the new bride. There was also audio of Chenila's phone call with Detective Rodriguez in Manila, clearly establishing her role in investigating Perlah's background. When this evidence reached human rights lawyers in the Philippines, it was forwarded to media outlets and organizations. The story exploded across news channels, with pressure mounting on both UAE and Philippine governments to demand a real investigation. The narrative of a tragic medical emergency collapsed when faced with evidence of premeditation, surveillance, and a systematic campaign to expose and destroy a vulnerable woman who had been trying to build a better life for herself and her child. The Al-Mansouri family's attempts to control the story had failed, and the truth was finally demanding to be heard. 8 months after Perlah's death, Dubai's most sensational trial began in a courtroom packed with media, human rights observers, and members of Dubai's elite who had come to watch one of their own face justice. Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed, once the golden son of an oil dynasty, sat in the defendant's chair charged with first-degree murder, while his first wife Chenila faced charges of conspiracy and intimidation of witnesses. The prosecution's case was devastating in its methodical precision. Lead prosecutor Amira Al-Zahra presented evidence of a systematic campaign of psychological torture that had escalated to murder. The courtroom fell silent as Detective Elena Rodriguez testified via video link from Manila, her 20 years of law enforcement experience lending weight to her detailed account of Chenila's investigation request and the specific, damaging information she had sought about Perlah's background. The most damaging testimony came from Perlah's own voice. The secret recordings she had made were played in the hushed courtroom, including one devastating conversation where Chenila explicitly discussed the timing of revealing evidence that would destroy this marriage and humiliate my husband publicly. Her voice, calm and calculating, contrasted sharply with the grieving family member she had portrayed after Perlah's death. Dr. Amira Hassan's forensic testimony painted a brutal picture of Perlah's final moments. The defensive wounds on her hands, the pattern of injuries, and the evidence of a prolonged struggle demolished any remaining pretense that this had been a medical emergency. When prosecutors displayed photographs of the crime scene, several jury members visibly recoiled at the violence that had taken place in what should have been a honeymoon suite. Rashid's defense team attempted to portray their client as a victim of manipulation by both women, arguing that the revelation of Perlah's deception had caused a temporary break from reality. They painted him as a traditional man overwhelmed by the collision between his values and modern deceptions, driven to madness by the systematic lies of two calculating women. Chenila's lawyers took a different approach, claiming she had been protecting her family from a dangerous fraud who had infiltrated their household. They argued that her investigation of Perlah was legitimate security work, and that she could not have foreseen the violent reaction her revelations would provoke. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge's verdict was swift and decisive. Rashid was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Chenila received 15 years for conspiracy, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. In his sentencing statement, Judge Hassan Al-Mahmoud delivered words that would be remembered long after the courtroom emptied. This case represents the dangerous extreme of what happens when traditional values become weapons of control, when the pursuit of purity becomes justification for psychological torture, and when family honor becomes more important than human dignity. The trial's conclusion marked only the beginning of the Al-Mansouri family's destruction. Their business empire, built over generations, crumbled as international partners distanced themselves from the scandal. Abu Saeed, the family patriarch, suffered a stroke during the trial and never fully recovered, spending his final years watching everything he had built dissolve into legal fees and settlements. Criminal investigations revealed decades of financial irregularities, leading to additional charges against family members who had once seemed untouchable. The social ostracism was perhaps more devastating than the legal consequences. In Dubai's tightly knit elite circles, the family name became synonymous with violence and deception. Rashid's children found themselves unwelcome in the social networks that had defined their lives, their futures compromised by their father's actions and their stepmother's calculated cruelty. Chenila's fall was particularly complete. The family she had tried to protect disowned her entirely, viewing her as the architect of their destruction. Her assets were frozen during the investigation, and the social position she had spent decades building evaporated overnight. The woman who had once commanded respect and fear in Dubai's elite circles found herself facing prison as a pariah, abandoned by everyone she had thought she could rely on. The case forced Dubai to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the treatment of domestic workers. New laws were enacted specifically targeting psychological harassment and stalking, with severe penalties for those who used traditional values to justify abusive behavior. Background check requirements for marriages were strengthened, and protections for domestic workers were expanded. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Dubai's society began to examine itself. The mirror had cracked, and there was no returning to the beautiful lie of perfection that had hidden such ugly truths. Public debates emerged about the balance between tradition and modernity, about the responsibilities of privilege, and about the price paid by vulnerable people who dared to dream of better lives. In Nueva Ecija, Philippines, Princess May Santos continued to be raised by her grandmother Rosa, supported now by a foundation established in her mother's memory. The little girl who would never know her mother's sacrifice had become the symbol of a tragedy that exposed how desperation, tradition, and power could combine with deadly consequences. The blood on those marble floors had told its story, and Dubai would never be quite the same. Some secrets, once exposed, change everything they touch, leaving behind questions that can never be fully answered and wounds that never completely heal.